Big Apple Blitz with Anthony Rivardo and Matt O'Leary.
Hello and welcome into another episode of Big Apple Blitz. One day delayed, but we are here for you on a lovely Tuesday morning. What's going on? Matt O'Leary with Anthony Rivardo. Anthony, how's it going today?
I'm doing great, man. I'm excited to talk some Giants and some Jets. Some more interesting storylines coming out of the Jets. But with the Giants, things a little slow for them, but still some intrigue. They did sign a player today, which I'm excited to discuss. And really looking forward towards training camp. Some of the position battles that we might see are beginning to take shape.
Slow. You just landed a UFL star. How could you be so down right now? He's going to lead the Giants in rushing this year, I thought.
Possibly, but probably not. I would assume that'll be Devin Singletary, but Jacob Sailors, I think that's how you say his name, had a very good season in 2023 with the UFL playing for, I don't even remember which team, to be completely honest, but he was playing in the UFL and he was second in the league in rushing, and he put up some decent receiving numbers as well. Scored about 8 touchdowns last season. Yeah, the St. Louis Battlehawks, which is, first of all, a pretty cool name. I do have to give credit to the UFL. They have some pretty cool team names, and the uniforms were pretty sick for the Battlehawks as well. But yeah, Jacob Saylor is probably competing on the back end of this roster, but an interesting signing here, a guy with a little bit of NFL experience, no regular season experience, but preseason and practice squad, and overall just an intriguing signing.
Yeah, another camp body, which this is the time of year for those kind of signings. You bring in these guys and, you know, they're fun storylines to root for. I'm sure he's going to get some run in the preseason games, you know, in the second half of these games, especially. You know, they're not playing anyone who, you know, is a starter, or a lot of teams even on the second string. But, you know, every year somebody makes noise that you don't expect. There's a surprise guy making the roster, and who knows, maybe it could be Sailors. And you've kind of mentioned that after Singletary on, you know, as the lead back, so to speak, it's kind of up for grabs how the pecking order kind of goes from there from the Giants.
Yeah, that's for sure. And once you get past the first two running backs, Devin Singletary and the rookie Tyrone Tracy, that running back 3 job, you would assume goes to Eric Gray, 5th round pick last year. But the Giants didn't seem to want to put Eric Gray on the field last year. So as a 5th round pick, you could cut your losses this offseason if you really want to. Though I like Eric Gray, and I think he will make the roster, and he should. You could potentially move on from him for some of these other talents. Not only Jacob Saylor is now competing for this position, but you also have Dante Miller, who the Giants signed earlier in this offseason, who missed the NFL draft for some sort of eligibility problem in NCAA, but ran a 4.27 40 and put up like a ridiculous number of bench reps. I think the number was like 27 or something crazy. So I think my main takeaway from this actually is that the Giants are open to any avenue to find a talent, and they're scouting talent in pretty much any corner and crevice, which is a good thing because the Giants have a problem with talent. They don't have like an excess amount of it. So looking anywhere to find it, I think, is a really good strategy for this Giants team, and getting creative and out of the box to find some of these running backs. But I ultimately think that running back 3/4 job is going to come down to one of these creatively found runners, whether it's Dante Turbo Miller, that player that I mentioned, or if it is Jacob Saylors, or we'll see what happens with Eric Gray, since the Giants didn't seem to want to use him last year. But there is some sort of a battle taking shape here now in that running back 3/4 zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like, you're going to carry more than 2 running backs. Like, you know, Tyrone Tracy, that's right. He should be slotted in, you know, the 5th rounder from this year, probably should be slotted in as the second back. But, you know, beyond that, as you kind of mentioned, Gray, I'd almost be surprised in a way if they gave up on him that quickly. Like, I just don't feel like we saw enough from him last year to determine one way or the other if he can be a guy or if he can't. So to cut bait that quick, I think would be surprising for me, at least.
It would be surprising for me as well, but It just feels like he's one of those players that could sneakily be cut because the Giants, again, just didn't seem interested in using him. Like when Saquon Barkley was injured last year, Giants fans were like, okay, well, let's see what we have in this rookie. Maybe we drafted a stud in the 5th round and he's going to go in there and turn into the eventual starter of this team. And then he didn't get a single carry in one of those games. And then in the next game, he got like 5 or less. So it was just like, okay, they have no interest in putting this kid on the field. And when they did put him on the field, he looked decent in the backfield, but they also tried him out a lot on special teams, and he did struggle there as a return specialist. So it just overall felt like the Giants weren't crazy about what they saw from Eric Gray in practice and were afraid to see how that would translate to the regular season field. So sometimes when you see something like that, a team maybe makes a premature decision and they do cut bait rather quickly. Again, I don't think that they should. I like Eric Gray. I thought he was a good talent at Oklahoma, but it wouldn't completely shock me if the Giants felt like, hey, this is not a player we can depend on. Maybe some of these other camp bodies that we brought in are a little bit more dependable and we like them better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Johnny Boy's hanging out with us. What's going on, Johnny? Just wanted to give him a shout out. He's hanging in the chat as usual. But that's a good point. It kind of reminds me of what's going on with the Jets a little bit with Izzy Abanikanda, who they drafted last year on day 3 of the draft, and then now, they draft 2 more running backs in the mid rounds this past year, and it seems like they already jumped Izzy Abanikanda on the depth chart. So. Not quite the same in the Giants. The Giants went back to the well, but it's not like they went back and took 2 backs. But it seems like maybe fair to say that each the Jets and the Giants may be souring on the running back they took just a year ago.
Yeah, and again, it's really unfortunate. And I feel like it's really just a lack of proper developing from the Giants in particular here because, like I said, they had opportunities to get Eric Gray on the field, and maybe they didn't feel like he was fully ready. Okay, that's fine, but I feel like that's probably on the fault of the Giants. You got to get your guys ready so that if Saquon Barkley does go down in week 5 or whenever he went down last year, Eric Gray is available and ready to go. He should be ready. And that's on the fault of the coaching staff, in my opinion, for the fact that he wasn't ready, if that's how they felt. And we should have seen some Eric Gray snaps because if he put in one decent game and put on enough game film in that matchup to tell you going into the offseason that he can be your running back 3 or even running back 2, maybe you didn't have to spend a 5th round pick on a running back again this year if you gave Eric Gray some more playing time. So again, I thought that was just really poorly done by the Giants coaching staff last season. That was one of the main criticisms that I had for them throughout the year was their lack of interest in utilizing Eric Gray in any form on the offensive side of the ball. So now we're going into the season with a big question mark because we don't know what we have with Gray. And I think that's unfortunate that the Giants wasted an entire year not finding out who else they had in their backfield other than Saquon Barkley just to let Saquon Barkley walk in free agency.
It's so funny the parallels that you could draw between these 2 teams. And unfortunately, when you're not a very good football team, you usually tend to make mistakes. And I think the Jets did, again, to just bring it back to the Jet side for a second. This is what they did. They kept running the corpse of Dalvin Cook into the ground and wouldn't put Izzy on the field to spell Breece Hall last year because allegedly Izzy Abanikanda couldn't pass protect. And like Dalvin Cook was horrendous in pass protection last year. So it was just like, it never made sense. It never really added up. And now kind of the same thing, hearing that, something very similar happened on the Giant side of things. It's, I don't know, head scratchers for both sides on this one, I think.
Yeah, and it's that kind of poor development process and poor development plan that gets you in situations where you end up overdrafting positions or overpaying at positions, kind of like we discussed in last week's show when we were talking about how teams, the best teams, draft at positions of strength and then develop those players to take over when those contracts expire. This is one of those situations where the Giants could have done that here with Eric Gray. He could have succeeded Saquon Barkley. Instead, they didn't give Eric Gray any playing time. They didn't know what they had in him. So running back was a need. And then they had to go sign Devin Singletary and add Tyrone Tracy in the draft. So again, this is just malpractice from the Giants coaching staff in many ways. I don't know who you blame here, whether that's Brian Dable or if it's Mike Kafka or if it's the former running backs coach who was fired this offseason. Could be a combination of all 3 of them and probably is. But I do feel like the Giants really mishandled that situation. And now they're adding in another guy here, Jacob Sailors. They add in Dante Miller. We don't know who any of these guys are or what they really provide to the team. All we know is now we got a camp battle that needs to be sorted out throughout the summer. And unfortunate for Eric Gray, I think that he should have already had his position locked in by now with some extra playing time last season.
Absolutely. So curious to see how this ends up shaking out for the Giants with their third spot. And, again, we rattled through the names, Eric Gray, Corbin, Miller, and now you're adding Jacob Sailors to the mix too. It's a lot of carries to go around in these preseason games. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. So meanwhile, we really want to see the Giants be a more pass heavy team this year and utilize some of the playmakers in their receiving core. But throughout the preseason, rather, we're probably just going to see them hand the ball off a whole ton because they got to see what they have in this backfield and along this offensive line. So probably going to be some boring preseason games for the Giants, but who knows? You never know when a Victor Cruz will rise from the ashes.
There we go. First State Jets hanging out with us too. Let's go, boys. One day closer to camp opening. I know you're very excited about that, Anthony. All football fans should be excited as we inch closer to training camp here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited for training camp. I'm hoping that I'm able to make some sort of trip up to New York during camp so I can go to at least one or two of the practices and check in with some of the Giants and Fireside Giants fans. That's the hope. But at the end of the day, I'm just really excited to see this team actually get back on the field and get some really intriguing storylines coming out of those camp battles and everything else. I think training camp is one of the most exciting times in the NFL calendar.
Absolutely. So good transition to our first Jets topic of the day. A camp star from last year, Xavier Gipson, ended up having a huge play in the season opener last year against Buffalo, the punt return for a touchdown game winner. And then was a little bit quiet after that, but some interesting reports coming out of mini camp from last week that kind of flew under the radar for us. A lot of focus, obviously, on Aaron Rodgers and Hassan Reddick, the two big stories. But right now, with Mike Williams out, Xavier Gipson's actually kind of been the Jets' number 2 receiver, which is a little surprising for me. I think even when Mike Williams is healthy right now, it looks like that Gipson would be starting in the slot with Malachi Corley behind him. And I guess in a way I am surprised, but I probably shouldn't be at the same time because this organization, the Jets, have consistently within this regime taken it very, very slowly with their rookies. Like, for instance, now this didn't last into the season, but Sauce Gardner at this time in his rookie year was in a competition, in air quotes, to be a starting corner. And then he ends up being a bona fide starter. For Garrett Wilson, he wasn't utilized at all the first game against Baltimore. He had, just a handful of catches in that game. Really not much going on before his big breakout game against Cleveland. And I'm wondering if the Jets' plan is something similar with Corley, where they kind of really have to see him in training camp in the preseason and see him prove it before they have him jump an already established player, if you will, on the roster.
And I think that makes sense. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to be that way based on the excitement level of Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh after drafting Malachi Corley. Of course, they revealed their text messages, Corley no matter what. So you would think that there's a lot of excitement there and he would immediately get on the field. But I do think it's smart for any NFL team to determine that every single rookie has to earn their spot and earn their playing time. And Corley's no different. And also with Malachi Corley, there's an element of he's not your traditional wide receiver. He's not your traditional playmaker. He is very much going to be a gadget player, most likely early on in his career, and then eventually hopefully develop into a full-time starter. So the Jets are probably thinking, we have a player who can just play wide receiver with Xavier Gipson. Let's go ahead and develop Malachi Corley during training camp and see where he fits and how he's going to fit into the game plan and structure of the offense. That's probably what it is to me, I would assume. With Corley, again, you just don't know exactly what his role is going to be just yet. So you can't really take away snaps from other players during 7-on-7 drills when they're just playing the normal role of running the wide receiver route. So I think that would be my takeaway here, is that the Jets still want to take their time figuring out and piecing together what Malachi Corley's role is going to be in the offense.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, something we've talked about with Malachi Corley ever since the Jets drafted him is his yards after the catch ability and how physical of a runner he is. And that's very hard to show in 7-on-7 without pads too. So, and not necessarily that he's going to be like running guys over in training camp practices, but I just feel like his game doesn't necessarily translate as well as compared to like Garrett Wilson, who just seemingly gets open at will. That like his game is more suited for the 7-on-7 and like these kinds of opportunities where Corley, like you kind of get him the ball in space and then watch what he does after that. So, I'm not, and this isn't like me hitting the panic button, nor do I think Jet fans should hit the panic button on Malachi Corley. I think he will be a factor in this offense. I think it was maybe more so like the Jets are still very high on Xavier Gibson, and maybe we shouldn't be sleeping on, his role on this or in this offense in 2024.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And both points that you made with Corley, a lot of the intrigue with him is when he gets the ball into his hands, he likes to run people over and break tackles. You can't really do that in 7-on-7. So, what are you going to see from him? I do think it's important to get him out there and get him his reps so that he can refine some of his route running. But like you said, maybe the Jets just look at Xavier Gibson rather highly and think that he's going to be a contributor for their team. Obviously, on special teams, the kick return or punt return last year in week 1 was his main heroic moment, but maybe they feel like there's more talent to be unlocked there as a wide receiver and on the offensive side of the ball. So continuing to develop that and hone in on those skills is definitely important for UDFA, who showed some intrigue last season and could be in store for a little bit of a developmental jump here in year 2.
Yeah, and this is someone that Aaron Rodgers really liked last year during both Hard Knocks and the Jets, own social content that they would put out there. He spoke very highly on both Xavier Gibson and Jason Brownlee, two guys last year who were UDFAs. But for Gibson in particular, Randall Cobb kind of took him under his wing last year, and we know how much Randall Cobb means to Aaron Rodgers and the relationship that they have and how close they are. Like Aaron Rodgers is the godfather of one of Randall's kids. So, if Randall Cobb saw something in Xavier Gibson and maybe like the Jets or Rodgers view Gibson as like a poor man's version of, let's say, what Randall Cobb was at his best, like I don't know, there's a role for that in this offense. So again, maybe I think this is kind of more just like myself included, but maybe fans not realizing that maybe Gibson isn't, going to be this team's 6th receiver and be a fringe roster guy. He's going to, serve a purpose as a depth player, but most of that coming out of the slot.
Yeah, and depth in the slot is super important. I feel like, anecdotally speaking, I have evidence to back this up, but slot receivers, just because they're doing all that dirty work, running over the middle of the field and taking big hits, oftentimes can get banged up. So having depth at slot receiver is always a major plus. So if you feel like Xavier Gibson can contribute for you out of the slot and be a refined route runner and make some of those dirty plays over the middle of the field, or give you quality minutes and snaps when a player is injured, you got to find the value in that and continue to develop him throughout training camp. So it's going to be really interesting to see once we get to camp next month how Xavier Gibson performs and who he matches up against and who he beats and who he loses against. So that's going to be one of the more fun storylines, I think, for some of these back end of the roster Jets players.
Yeah, really good comment here from First State Jets. The Jets blew a lot of air into Corley Balloon. I like his game, but temper expectations. Some NFL is big boys, and that's true. And I'm not down on Corley. I don't think First State Jets is down on Corley. I've just seen some who kind of have him, written in stone as going to be number 2 behind, Garrett Wilson in receiving. But I think there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. You look at, Garrett as the number 1 target, I think is a lock to go over 1,000 yards. I mean, he's put up like 1,100 each of the last 2 years with garbage quarterback play. I think he'll get his. But beyond that, you have, Corley and Gibson and Mike Williams and Breece Hall out of the backfield and Tyler Conklin. Like, I just think there's going to be this big kind of clump of guys together, and they're between like 300 and 500 receiving yards. And if that's where he ends up, I don't think you should just look at the box score and go, oh, well, he only had 300 receiving yards this year. Well, what was the circumstances like? What was the targets like, and how did the Jets offense perform? So I think we have to take all those kind of things into factor here.
Yeah, I agree. And this is no slight against Corley, but I do feel like he is a player who probably needs a longer time to develop than many other young wide receivers just because of his unique skill set. And again, like I said, the Jets needing to figure out what his role is going to be. He could be a player that starts off as a gadget piece for your offense for the first season of his career. By year two, he's really refined certain things. Now he's playing as your true slot receiver, and then he's going for 700 yards. So I think that like any draft pick, Corley is a player who you didn't draft for the 2024 season. You drafted for 2024, 25, 26, 27, and hopefully even further. And so that goes for Corley, goes for pretty much all of these prospects. But with Corley, because of how unique his skill set is, he's definitely a player who's going to need time to develop. And I think he's going to be a tremendous talent. I'm also really high on him. We spoke really highly of him on Fireside Giants prior to the draft. Alex was a huge fan and was devastated to see him go to the Jets, actually. But yeah, I think he's a player who's going to be really exciting for this Jets team. But I also do agree with First Day Jets, where maybe some expectations do need to be tempered because he is a player that probably needs a little bit of a learning curve and needs to take some time before he really hits the ground running.
Absolutely. I think that is totally fair to look at it that way. And good on, Xavier Gipson, a surprise starter right now. We'll see if that carries over into training camp and the preseason. And I was very surprised to see this, but the New York Giants were listed as most improved team of the offseason. We want to get into that story that came out.
Yeah, that was Connor Orr of MMQB from Sports Illustrated saying that the Bears or the Giants were his picks, but he wanted to pick the Giants just because he felt like there were some big improvements that they made in the offseason. He cited in particular, I thought this was really interesting, that he likes the combination of Brian Dable and Drew Lock and is curious to see if it ends up bearing some Geno Smithian fruit for the Giants. So I thought of all the reasons to pick for the Giants to be most improved team, you'd probably point immediately to Brian Burns and Malik Neighbors, and he makes mention of those guys in the blurb on his article. But I thought that pointing towards Drew Lock was really interesting, and I don't even think there was a mention of Daniel Jones. Yeah, no Daniel Jones mentioned in his paragraph, so he must view Drew Lock as an upgrade over Jones, and must expect to see Drew Lock as a starter at some point this season.
That's a relatively hot take. I know, like, not saying being down on Daniel Jones is a hot take. That's kind of the consensus right now. But listing Drew Lock as an upgrade and potentially seeing him this year, I think would be interesting there. I do like a lot of what the Giants did this offseason. I don't want to come across as a hater because I don't think that's the case. I think they are trending in the right direction. I don't think they're there yet. I think they need another off season, and for me, a big part of it is I don't trust this quarterback room. Maybe it's our guy. Maybe Tommy DeVito, friend of the show, is the one who jumps in here and brings the Giants to the playoffs this year, which would be really exciting. But I think they're another year off and probably another quarterback away from making that jump back to being a playoff team.
Yeah, and I think I've made it really clear that I feel that way too about my Giants, unfortunately. I don't think they're going to be a playoff team this year, but I will say to this report or to this article opinion piece about Drew Lock maybe being an upgrade in this quarterback room and having this Geno Smith potential. The Geno Smith potential is interesting because sure, any quarterback who is a career backup for the most part and then gets a starting opportunity with a really great quarterbacks coach, you hope that he has that Geno Smith kind of breakout. But with Drew Lock, I don't necessarily think that he was an upgrade at backup quarterback. I thought that I still think that Tyrod Taylor, and credit to the Jets for signing him, is maybe the best pure backup quarterback in the NFL. He gives you really good spot starts. The health is obviously a problem with him,
Sure.
but he is a really good backup quarterback. And the Giants going from Tyrod Taylor, an established veteran backup quarterback, to Drew Lock, who's a little bit more of an unknown. Sure, ceiling is higher, potential is higher for him to maybe have a Geno Smith kind of developmental step in his career, but in terms of an upgrade for this upcoming season, I don't think that they improved the backup quarterback job. In fact, I think that they in some ways kind of downgraded here. So yeah, I'm not super high on Drew Lock. Like I'm excited by it because of the Geno Smith thing, but let's be realistic about it. If we're seeing Drew Lock on the field, first of all, we've got some problems, and second of all, I'd just rather see Tommy DeVito.
Yeah, I don't think that's unfair too, because I mean, DeVito's a rookie last year and had a few nice games, and yeah, was it in all likelihood was it an insanity run? Like, yeah, that's probably the most likely outcome, but we don't know. Like, if he plays well in the preseason and shows a little bit of a spark. We've talked at length about the Daniel Jones contract, and you don't want to take the risk of him getting hurt. Like, what's the downside to playing either Locke or Tommy DeVito in that spot instead?
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. And I think that if Daniel Jones is just mediocre this year, you can't justify putting him on the field because of that injury clause in his contract, which we've talked about at length before. And then when you get to that point where you're taking Jones out of the lineup, sure, you see what you have in Drew Lock. But if he's mediocre, then you know what you've got, at least to some extent, with Tommy DeVito. But you know that he was a rookie last year, and he potentially could take a big step forward if he gets even more playing time. So I would be pretty quick to get DeVito on the field if I'm taking Jones out of the lineup. Over Drew Lock, I would like to see Tommy DeVito. I just think it makes more sense from a potential standpoint. And I think that DeVito's potential is definitely there. But for the rest of this team and how upgraded it is, since it was listed the most improved team, I also think it's interesting to see that he mentions Wink Martindale towards the end of this and says this defense is seriously formidable, though I would have liked to have seen a repair in the Martindale-Dable relationship to the point where Martindale would have gotten to use Burns. And I actually disagree with that as well, because with Wink Martindale, the way that his defense was set up, it's never been a kind of scheme that caters towards the strengths of edge rushers. Edge rushers have often been held back in Wink Martindale's schemes. I don't think we would have been able to maximize the potential of Brian Burns in the Wink Martindale defense, whereas with Shane Bowen's defense, which is very much going to be 4-3, let the edge rushers rush and stop dropping them back into coverage, I think that we could see Brian Burns go for a very high sack total in this defensive scheme. So I actually disagree with this one. He's saying that the downgrade here was moving on from Martindale. I think that the upgrade was moving on from Martindale and getting Shane Bowen. I think that's going to allow this defense to be a lot better this season.
I like that a lot. Tony chimes in and says both McDonald and Thibodeau taking a jump this year. Do you see the breakout in year three, for KT, and year 2 for Will McDonald?
I hope for Will McDonald, for Jets fans' sakes, because like that pick was confusing when it was made. It's still kind of confusing, but there is an avenue now for him to see more playing time. And I think that might tie into a conversation that we're going to have on Hassan Reddick. Maybe we do see some Will McDonald a little bit more than we expected this season. And then with Kayvon Thibodeau, there should be a jump kind of because of what I just mentioned, where Shane Bowen's defense is pretty much just going to ask the outside linebackers / defensive ends to be edge rushers and pass rush. And he's not going to ask them to drop into coverage 85 times like Martindale did last season with Kayvon Thibodeau. 85 snaps in coverage, not something that feels like a ginormous sample size in comparison to the 1,000 that he played or whatever on the season, but relative to the rest of the outside linebackers / edge rushers in the NFL, it was a very high total. And it's a lot of opportunities there where he could just be getting after the quarterback, especially on third downs where he was dropping into coverage. Why not let him get after the quarterback? That's what he does best. So I thought there were many ways where Martindale excelled, and getting takeaways was one of the best ways. I mean, we were tied with the Ravens for the most takeaways in the league last year, but the overall down-to-down productivity of the pass rushers and pressure generated was lacking. And that was because of Martindale's reliance on blitzing and getting creative rather than just asking his talent to be talented. And I think that Thibodeau is talented, and this year he's going to have a greater opportunity to flex that talent.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Thibodeau lining up more so as that defensive end rather than the 3-4 outside linebacker. Like putting his hand in the dirt is going to be really helpful for his game, because there's no reason that someone that talented as a pass rusher should be dropping back into coverage. The 11.5 sacks last year, like that's a good number, but as you mentioned, the pressures are probably not where you want them to be. But I think that's something that could improve. And for Will McDonald, I don't know if it's fair to expect the kind of leap we saw from Jermaine Johnson in year 1 into year 2. But I do think McDonald will be a much more utilized player. I wanted to pull up his snap count. He only played 19% of defensive snaps last year, and he finished with 3 sacks in that time. So I think if that number is closer to 50, I think you're probably looking at like somewhere between 6 and 8 sacks in a rotational role, which I think you'll take that from, a young guy who's, again, a part of a rotation, which is what the Jets will be relying on. But I agree with Tony and I agree with you. I think both those players, young guys for the Jets and Giants, do take a step forward in their development this year.
Yeah, and you could argue that Thibodeau already took that step forward because he had the 11 sacks or 11 and a half, whatever it was last season. But I think that we all know, if you take a look at the analytics and you take a closer look at the stats, a lot of those sacks were cleanup sacks, and he didn't really have the down-to-down productivity as a pass rusher as we would hope for. And again, I think a lot of that had to do with what he was asked to do in Martindale's defense. So definitely envisioning a big jump for both of those players and hoping that comes to fruition.
Anything else on just this story on the Giants being the most improved team here before we roll into our final Jets topic?
I will say, and I know that we've said it a few times, Malik Neighbors being added to this offense pushes everyone down the depth chart and makes everybody better. Like Slayton's going up against cornerback 2/3s now. Same for Wandale. Hyatt is the 4th receiver on this team, technically on the depth chart. This Giants receiving core is very underrated, and I actually think it's one of the best in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4 talent in the NFL. It's got to be top 5 if you're going through the depth of it. So I'm really excited about that receiving core. And if the Giants offense does take a big leap this year, it's probably because they have 2,000-yard receivers this season.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited to watch Malik Neighbors. I think you're going to get the Garrett Wilson kind of production where it just doesn't matter that, the quarterback's not throwing for a bunch of yards. Like, he's just going to get open. He's going to get the ball. It's going to be a lot of fun. So we talked about in the first segment, right? With the Giants adding a new running back. Yeah, you're going to have to carry probably 4 running backs on your roster, but I think the path to success for this Giants, offense is through the air with their deep wide receiver room.
Completely agreed. And I'm hoping that we get that kind of Garrett Wilson production out of Malik Neighbors, because I'd really hate to see the Giants waste this kid's talent for a year, biding their time with Daniel Jones before actually getting a decent quarterback next offseason. Shout out Dak Prescott, 2025 New York Giants quarterback.
That is going to be a lot of fun to talk through this for us. I know we're going to put a pin in that one. I saw you on Twitter tweeting through that. I like that idea. I don't know if June of 2024 is the right time to get into it fully, but I like that. We're going to revisit that in a few months.
I hope we do.
All right, let's close with Hassan Reddick, the big story for the Jets. I feel like every episode before, we talk every episode before we hop on, and I'm like, all right, another Hassan Reddick story today. But Rich Cimini had a story where he was reporting that at the time of the trade, the Jets pitched Hassan Reddick that, they wouldn't close the book on an extension, but their plan was kind of to let the year play out. If he plays well, it could be a big money with either the Jets or on free agency in the market. Reddick was good with that, and then something's changed since then. I think the obvious change to me is John Franklin Myers is no longer here. When Hassan Reddick was acquired, the Jets already had John Franklin Myers as well, who's played well for this team for a while now. Well, he's gone. So now I think Hassan Reddick's looking around and going, all right, the Jets don't really have a choice, it feels like. So I don't have any guaranteed money left on my deal. Why am I going to now show up after all this?
Yeah, and it makes sense for him to kind of reach that conclusion that he probably should hold out. I know that we've kind of discussed it before, where The Jets, should they not extend him? Should they increase his incentives? What should they do? But for Hassan Reddick, and from his perspective, this line of thinking does make sense. Like, if you don't have any guaranteed money, why go risk getting injured at this offseason camp? The Jets clearly need you and need to value you more than they did a couple months ago, now that they've lost some of their other edge rushing talents. So, yeah, I mean, he is more valuable to them now than he was back when he got traded there. And for that reason, he probably has a good cause to ask for more money.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I'm curious to see how the Jets end up playing this one out. We've both kind of talked that we'd almost rather see the Jets go with their original approach and not give him a long, big contract. But I don't think he's going to be in a spot where he's going to be willing to sit out this season at his age. Like, I think eventually, if push came to shove, that he would end up reporting if the Jets didn't offer him a new deal. Because again, like, what are you going to do? You're going to sit out your age 30 season? I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I don't think that sitting out is really reasonable for him, but he's definitely going to hold out until he gets that deal, I would assume. And, I think that a raise makes the most sense. If he wants a long term deal, that's a whole nother conversation that I know we've kind of discussed. But I think the more and more I look at the situation, giving him some sort of incentive based raise for this upcoming season, or just giving him some guarantees, there are different ways that you can do it. Scrap up the rest of this contract for this year and just give him a new one for 1 year. There are ways for the Jets to probably appease him, make him happy for the season without committing too much of their money down the road. And I think that's probably the route that they should go. But for Hassan Reddick, you're entering a pivotal season. You're going to be 30 and you don't have a whole lot of guarantees. I don't think that there's any reason for him to risk any kind of injuries with no guaranteed money on his deal.
Yeah, and First State Jets chimes in, says owners destroyed the players' ability to hold out in the CBA. Plus, no owners stick together like NFL owners. Screw on you, screw them all. If he holds out, he kills his free agency payday. That's right. Like, he's kind of like you're stuck. He doesn't really have a choice. Like, if the Jets go, all right, well, we're just not going to pay you. Is he gonna demand the trade again and like go through this somewhere else? I don't know what the end result ends up being here. It's either the Jets cave and maybe they find some sort of middle ground, or he ends up just playing on this deal.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, he's probably going to have to play on the deal, but I think that the Jets should do something similar to what the Giants just did with Darius Slayton. Slayton also entering the final year of his deal, salary really low. He's criminally underpaid for his production at his position. You could say the same thing for Hassan Reddick. Slayton didn't get an extension. He didn't get a massive raise. He just got a few $100,000 worth of incentives. And that was enough to get him back in the building for minicamp and get him ready to play for training camp in the regular season, but not enough to make Darius Slayton actually happy and feeling secure with his future with the team. And ultimately, I think that something similar is probably going to happen with Reddick, where they do find this middle ground. Reddick can get a little bit more money this season, but it's probably going to be baked into incentives, especially now that they're having this kind of debate here and having this standoff. I think that that's probably the route that the Jets should take. Now you're seeing maybe some character flaws shine through potentially, if you want to call it that, where if the Jets feel slighted and feel lied to, they probably aren't going to feel comfortable committing more millions of dollars down the road for extra seasons. So I think that something similar to what happened with Darius Slayton and an incentive increase is probably the best solution for all parties involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tony with another good question: how many 1-year deals given to the 22 starters? For the Jets, they have a lot. I mean, just going through on off the top of my head, Mike Williams is a projected starter. That's one. Tyron Smith was given a 1-year deal. Is two. Do we count Morgan Moses? He was traded for and has 1 year remaining on his deal. I would say it's close enough, right? Three. Reddick is the last year of his deal there. Four. You also had Solomon Thomas on a 1-year deal, Chuck Clark on a 1-year deal. Well, Solomon Thomas isn't a starter, so I won't include him. But five, 5 guys, 5 of the 22 on a 1-year deal.
That is a little concerning. Doesn't give you a whole lot of confidence in the continuity that you're going to have going into the following season. So,
Well, it's the last dance Jets this year. They are loading up to try to make a real push at it. Maybe, and then I think for some of it, like you have Olu Fashanu in the wings at left tackle to eventually come in and play. Wide receiver could be an issue. I'm trying to think of where else could potentially be an issue for this team down the road. Interior defensive line is honestly something behind Quinnen. Like, I'm not the biggest Javon Kinlaw fan, and I don't know if Leaky Fotu is going to fill in as good as what Al Woods was last year for this team. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of does tie into the conversation that I brought up earlier and that we've been having in a few recent episodes where the best teams draft at positions of strength. So even if you have some of these players, like you just mentioned, with Olu Fashanu at left tackle, yes, they have Tyron Smith, great player, who they acquired this offseason, and they have Morgan Moses on the right side. But now they also have a young player behind those guys developing. Once he's ready to take over, there's no learning curve, there's no growing pains. He just takes over and is a good player. And I think that's really important. So it does tie into that kind of conversation that we're continuing to have about roster building and how the Jets have done a pretty solid job of it.
Yeah, they have. I think, roster's in a good spot. It's, again, I feel like beating a dead horse, but it's something we've hit on a lot this offseason. It's on the players and it's on this coaching staff to prove that they're legit. There's no excuses. They can't go 7-10 again and then just be like, hey, we're going to run this whole thing back because, whatever reason you want to come up with. Like, I don't really care about the injury excuse anymore. It's time to see it on the field.
Completely agreed. And like I said, if I have any question marks about this team, it's not on the roster, it's on the coaching staff. But it is the last dance Jets, like you said. So if Aaron Rodgers has any magic left in the tank, he's got to put it on the field this season.
Can we this is not on the running order, but this was tweeted out. I think this is a good place to close because you might see me have a slight meltdown here. This is an insane stat that I wanted to discuss with you or run by you. So the Michael Nania, he covers the Jets for Jet X Factor, tweeted out a stat saying most games allowing 300 yards or fewer since 2022, which is the last 2 years, and the record in those games. The Jets are second they've done it 17 times. The 49ers are first. They in 18 games, they are 14-4, which is a 7.78 win percentage. The Jets have done it 17 times. What do you think their record is in those 17 games? For context, Cleveland is on the list at 12-5. Baltimore is 11-5. Kansas City's 11-4. Miami 12-3. Buffalo 12-3 in games where they've allowed 300 yards or fewer. The Jets' record in those 17 games is what?
I would hope it's at least 10 wins. It's got to be at least 10.
8-9. That is depressing. A depressing state of what the Jets offense has been like and how frustrating the offense has been the last 2 years. When you are under 500 in games where your defense allows 300 yards or less, that is something to chew on right there.
Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, you hope and pray that Rodgers has some magic left in the tank and that he can turn that into a winning stat this season, because that is definitely one to be embarrassed by if you're Nathaniel Hackett.
He's just got to be, I don't know, if they have a top 20 quarterback play, that's, even just around hanging in mediocre range, vastly improved. The Jets have had the worst quarterback room the last 2 years. So good one to end on, I'd say here.
I agree.
I love it. So make sure to follow along with Anthony over at Fireside Giants for his Giants stuff, my Jets stuff you can find on my channel or Talking Jets, and quicker turnaround. We'll be back on Thursday. We pushed to Tuesday this week, but we will be back on Thursday. Any final thoughts before we call it a day?
Listen, man, if there's one thing that I want to see in training camp once we get there next month, it's more Tommy DeVito slow-mo.
Yes, I want to pull up Tommy DeVito slow-mo clips at some point soon, but that's going to do it for us on this episode, guys. Make sure to subscribe before you go. I'm Matt. He's Anthony, and we'll catch you next time.